This is the last of 3 Zoom discussions that we're hosting in partnership with the religion think tank Theos, which has been carrying out research into public attitudes into science, religion and the future of technology. Today, we're going to ask the question, drivers, doctors, friends, who will AI replace? As with last week, we've got a panel to kick off our discussion. And again, we've got loads of expert commentators in the room. We hope to hear from you as many of you as possible, even those that don't consider themselves experts, but almost certainly are. Please use the chat box to indicate if you'd like to ask questions and offer comments, and do also carry on parallel conversations between yourselves. We will not be offended. If you're using scientific or religious terms that might be unfamiliar to anybody, can I just ask you to explain them so that everyone can feel part of the conversation? Forgive me again if I sometimes hurry you along or interrupt you. And lastly, I need to alert you to the fact that the subject of sexual abuse will come up a couple of times during this discussion. So if you don't want to be part of that, just absent yourself for a little while. Hopefully it won't go on too long. Today, I'm joined by Hannah Waite, who's a researcher at the Theos think tank, by Professor Dame Sue Black, who is one of the world's leading forensic scientists and is currently the Pro Vice-Chancellor of Engagement at Lancaster University, soon to become President of St John's College in Oxford. Dr. Beth Singler, who's a research fellow in artificial intelligence at Homerton College at the University of Cambridge, and I hope Rabbi Laura Janner Klausner. So I'm going to start with Hannah. Hannah, you've been working with Nick Spencer from Theos on this research about public attitudes into AI, the future of technology, and how people feel about the possibility that machines might replace drivers, doctors, and friends. Why was it important for you to ask the question?
So why it was important for Nick and I to ask these questions was because when we've looked at science and religion in the broad spectrum of things, we find that people normally get fixated on topics like evolution or cosmology, and they aren't necessarily as relevant. They're still relevant, but as relevant or pressing to the 21st century today as they were when they first kind of emerged. Whereas conversations around AI, science and technology are becoming increasingly more prominent in our society and something that we need to discuss, right? And it becomes an area in which science and technology meets questions of religion and humanity in a way that's quite interesting to try and draw out. And that's why we ask the questions around AI.
So just tell me about the particular questions that you asked. So I think there are 3 main areas. Tell me about those questions and why those questions.
Yeah, so we asked our participants or those who took part in the survey if they would be reluctant to get into a self-driving car. Obviously, that's not that far away from what we've heard about happening at the moment. You know, I think Teslas sometimes can drive themselves to a certain degree and things, so it's not that uncommon. We then asked, would people prefer for a robot to conduct surgery on them rather than a human surgeon? And finally, we asked if people would consider getting an AI companion in the future.
Well, did you find was there anything particularly interesting or surprising about the results that you came up with?
Yeah, I think actually what I found quite interesting was that 1 in 5 people would consider getting an AI companion. I don't know if I thought it would be more or be less, but I don't know why. I just kind of, whenever you slim it down to 1 in 5 people, it's becoming more and more of a but something that we're going to see, I think, in the future. We also find, not necessarily surprisingly, but that men were less reluctant to get into a self-driving car, to have a robot can perform surgery on them, and were more interested in getting an AI companion than women. And we find that people who were under the age of 30 are more interested in those kinds of conversations, whereas people who are maybe a wee bit older, shall we say, and maybe aren't as familiar with technology were more hesitant and reluctant.
Thank you for that. Rabbi Laura Janner Klausner has managed to join us, which is great. Laura, I don't know what point you managed to join us, but we're talking about drivers, surgeons, friends, and how happy you would be to involve them in your life as machines rather than as people. What's your answer to that, and what might be the religious or ethical considerations that affects your answer?
For me, as Laura, personally, I have a lot of concerns about these things. I think autonomous cars, the technology is light years away from now, although there are certain things, cruise control plus, which we use already. But on the whole, I am very unlikely to use something that looks like a person that's not a person. However, when you asked about religious considerations, I think one of the things that is core is about the meaning of humanity. And if there are interactions which we hand over our agency to machines for, then we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean about our interactions with other humans, and what does this do to how we view human life and the what I would call the divinity within us of human life? So I think it does have a lot of implications theologically and, of course, ethically.
Sue Black, same question to you. Driver, surgeon, friend. Would you take any of these on as a machine rather than as a person?
No, I wouldn't personally. I am an anthropologist, and I believe the human is a social primate, and that social primate needs the interaction, I think, of other people. Often what our machines are doing is they're supplanting something else. And when you have a very short space of time on life, why would you settle for second best? When at the end of the day, human interaction for me is always going to be the better, partly because it's not predictable. And that's the lovely thing about being human, is that lack of predictability. Life becomes very grey when you know exactly what the outcome is going to be. But also,
you might not want something to be very unpredictable if you're under a surgeon's knife. I would have thought that...
Well, but the trouble is the human body is entirely unpredictable. And so the amount of variation that we have in the human body, I'd rather have somebody who has the unpredictability of being able to respond to a situation that they perhaps have never seen before. We see lawsuits in anatomy when a surgeon cuts an artery where they didn't think there was one. You can't train for every possibility when there's an infinite amount of variation. That's where it sits with surgeons for me. I want to have the trust in a human, and I want to be able to trade off that trust for what I feel is an acceptable level of risk.
Okay, so Beth Singler, where I thought I'd been in a driverless car, but it was 2016, so it probably wasn't a driverless car at all. But where are we up to with drivers, surgeons, and friends and machines?
Well, I think it's really important that we're realistic about where we are, and we unpack and unpick the hype, because we have to really ask who's driving the narrative. And I think that applies particularly on automated cars. I can make the driving pun there very easily. But we're actually seeing a lot of very distinct real world failures in this technology. But actually the story is that this is definitely where we're going. I think Laura's right. We're light years away from fully automated vehicles. What we'll see instead is vehicles that can't deal with the human world. So we have to adjust our behavior to deal with vehicles and give them even more space. We already give a lot of space to cars and individual car practices, to give even more space to automated versions. I think on the question of robot doctors, it's framed around surgeons. I don't actually think that's going to be the dominant form. We do see examples now. There was one just today or yesterday from Northampton about an assisting robot surgeon assisting a doctor. But the key aspects for artificial intelligence and medicine is automated decision-making systems. So in diagnostics and triage, who is actually behind the scenes making the final decision on what treatment you get and why, and what are the data points that are being inputted into those systems and where do they come from?
Mark Vernon's up early on the chat saying, hasn't it already been demonstrated that a doctor AI combination produces the best outcomes, at least in terms of diagnoses?
There's variables. So if it's purely human interaction with diagnosis, there's flaws. If it's purely AI interaction with diagnosis, there's flaws. So two together actually can cancel out each other's flaws. So when you have an artificial system that's looking at, say, scans, we don't always 100% know instantly what it is they are identifying in the scans. It can be the setup of the scan image itself, identifying the font used by a particular hospital that has a data set with more cases of a very distinct severe disease versus another data set. So it's unpacking that is really important as well. And I just wanted to get to friends to do the three. So we already have lots of chatbots that people anthropomorphize, and they feel like they're forming sort of parasocial relationships where they aren't equal social relationships because there's nothing on the other side, and that's a concern. It's something we looked at. I want to give a quick plug for my short film, Friend in the Machine, which was specifically about companionship. And one of the discussions we had during the making of that, which I think came out in the final film, is that there is a very strong difference between the perfect friend and the good enough friend.
Yeah.
And an AI that presents itself as the perfect friend might not at all be any use to us. So.
Yeah, I think the distinction between the best and the good enough might be something that we return to. Do put the details of those films in the chat box, won't you, so that people can have a look at them when they wish. Now, I'm going to bring in Hamish McRae. He's a columnist for The Eye, The Independent, The Mail on Sunday newspaper, and he's author of The World in 2050, How to Think About the Future. One of the things that we know is that AI is particularly active at the moment in the area of providing services for people, which the sort of dominant interest is in some parts of the world and not in the others. What do you think AI means for the future of work in the developed world, in the USA and the UK, in the next 30 years?
Well, in an ideal world, and we don't necessarily live in one, in an ideal world, what it does is enable service industries to improve their output, the quality of their output, quite radically, and cut their costs. We have
and increase their profits.
Well, the profit will go to someone or other. I mean, I think that a lot of the advantages actually in service industries will be in services which are largely or to a fair extent in the public sector. So I think education is one of the areas where you can do away with some of the things that human beings, the drudge work of human beings, and so they can then focus on the things where human interaction is really, really necessary. If you stand back, we have a problem. How do we increase global living standards without putting a larger footprint on the planet? And we do quite a lot in manufacturing. We've improved manufacturing quite radically. I mean, cars now are much better than they were 40 years ago. But services are difficult. It's very difficult to increase, to produce better high quality services without using more human beings. So if we can get the drudge work done by AI, and AI is very good at recognizing patterns, it's very good interacting with big data, and then leave the important stuff that only we as human beings can do to human beings. And that should enable living standards to go on rising without, as I say, putting too heavy a footprint on the planet.
I suppose the question is there enough work of the sort of the more positive kind, the non-judge work, to go round and provide a living for everybody? I mean, it's lovely on one level, isn't it, to say you don't have to do the drudge work. Let's find all these sort of creative pieces of work that you can do. But actually, you're going to have to create a need for those, aren't you?
I'm never worried about people having jobs. I mean, one of the astounding things is we have the world economy changing radically, and yet there are new jobs always coming along that we didn't know existed. And by and large, and I would say within the developer, by and large, the new jobs are, quotes, better, more fulfilling than the old jobs. So I'm not too worried about that. I mean, the thing that worries me is actually that we're in the very early stages of this revolution, and we have yet to establish the rules, the social etiquettes, the legal situation, the regulations, to make sure that we get the good things out and not the bad thing.
Is that work being done? Because it needs to be done now, as you say. I mean, is it being done? Beth, you might be the right person to answer this.
Yeah, the suggestions there are very interesting. The assumption that individuals will be able to move quite quickly into these wonderful new jobs that are being created is something that caused me quite great pause, that we sort of, we had periods of time in the past where people were very specific in what they were doing, like blacksmiths making horseshoes. When we no longer had a large population of horses, they didn't then just become the next great new job. They had to try and find a way to survive, and then their children perhaps had more access to those jobs. So there's that sort of level of personal apocalypse. So we forget about the robo-apocalypse and concerns about that, but the transitions and changes that individuals will have to go through if the tasks that they are specifically required to do are taken over.
Just a couple of things. I mean, I really agree with the points about, well, we are social beings. We can't actually exist outside of relationship anyway. So what tends to happen is we get to adults, and as adults, we reimagine what it must be like to have relationships with objects without taking into account that most people were born helpless, and they needed quite a significant number of years for someone to look after them in order that they could speak, think, walk, learn, etc. So what tends to happen is we've kind of forgotten this life history that we all have, which without this attachment, we wouldn't exist. And instead, we kind of jump straight into an adult frame of reference in terms of what's possible. So that would be my first point around this. I guess the other thing is whether we think that these, which I would just call representational objects, whether they're actually anything qualitatively different than a fictional story or an animation or a cartoon character or a bit of plasticine that you shape into a person. I personally don't, I think they're all in that kind of category. But somehow, because there's a lot of money in this and it is connected to work and productivity, they're put over here in this other category, somehow closer to us as human beings. And I think we really need to put them back where they belong, in the right ontology, because this conversation, even the whole conversation is mixing ontologies between what's human and non-human together.
Thank you. Thank you. Kathleen is an anthropologist and professor of ethics and culture of robots and AI at De Montfort University in Leicester, and I hope we'll hear from her again in a moment. Just Hamish, another question to you about, in talking about the future of work, you've talked about the drudge end of things. Where are the other areas that might fall either victim or benefit from the widespread introduction of AI?
Well, I think if you look at lots of things in the medical field, data analysis is done very much by human beings. And we found, and I'm not an expert on this, but we found, haven't we, at that things like looking at retina scans, that AI is just much better at picking out things that might be wrong with the retina than even doctors are. So the two working together there should be ideal. I think there's lots of other things in the legal society. An awful lot of legal work is just hunting through for precedents or looking through papers. All that sort of thing ought to be able to be done away with. In finance, there's lots of drudgery, just sorting out the details of new insurance policies and all that. Again, if you could manage to automate that, then you could actually have someone spending their time with the client in finance, saying, okay, what sort of pension plan do we really want? What do you really want? And use the human being time for that, as I say, and then getting rid of, once you've all agreed what you're trying to do, you push a button, AI sorts out all the paperwork.
Thank you. I'm going to come very briefly to Rabbi Laura Janner Klausner, and then I'm going to come to Sue Black for a really interesting case study.
I would love to differentiate between what we've used for years and years, which is electricity and machines, and huge data processing machines, because we're putting it all under the bracket of AI, which is very misleading. So I would say what these questions about surgeon and friend, and what was the third one? Surgeon, friend, and
drivers,
thank you. They're sort of sexy and interesting, but they don't, it's basically, when do you hand over agency for relationships? And I thought that the person in the chat, I couldn't see who it was, who talked about sexual relationships, is a really interesting corollary of this now. We
will be coming to that.
Excellent.
But actually, before, this is about sex, so trigger alert. I want to come to Sue Black. Sue's a forensic psychologist doing a rare and highly skilled job. An aspect of which, Sue, is that you, forgive me if I'm not putting this quite right, but you trained computers to assist in the job of identifying sex abusers through the vein patterns on their hands. Can you explain, well, first of all, why it was the vein patterns on their hands, what you've done, and what have been the benefits of that?
Thank you, Rosie. First of all, I'm not a forensic psychologist, so for anybody who is out there, I'm not pretending. So I'm a forensic anthropologist.
I do beg your pardon, mea culpa.
It's a very, very different world. And my job is often identification of perpetrators of crime. And child sexual abuse involves often images of that crime being committed. And the part of an offender that is often located within that image, because it's a contact crime, is the back of their hand. So as an anatomist and a forensic anthropologist, my job working with the police has been to match patterns of anatomy that we can see between one hand and the other. And we've been incredibly successful with it. But there are drawbacks. There are drawbacks because it means that I have to watch some of the most horrendous abuse against children that you can imagine, as does every police officer who works in this kind of a field. So being able to use AI to remove the emotion is actually incredibly helpful. So we've trained our systems to look through these videos and these images, find where there is a hand, and abstract the image of the hand so that you have it in no context. We can then look at the patterns of anatomy that we find in the hand, whether it's your vein patterns, and you can look at the back of your right and your left hands, the vein patterns will be different. Look at the patterns of pigments, so if you've got freckles or birthmarks or moles, looking at the pattern of skin creases across your knuckles, they're all different. These are big patterns, these are big data, and AI will abstract all of those for us. It will then compare the images that it sees in that of the offender with that of the suspect, and it will tell me what the likelihood is that they are the same individual. It means that I don't have to look at the images, we don't have to play those images in court, and the police officers don't have to look at them either. But where the court will stop, and I'm delighted at the prospect that they might do away with me as an expert in terms of AI, I don't think the court will yet allow that to happen. Because I think in court, the AI evidence will be heard, but the court will require the interpretation of that. And that interpretation, they will require a person to be there. But the change that AI will have made to my job and to my discipline will be incredible.
And it's already led, hasn't it, to, I don't know, 35 life sentences and 500 years for people in prison. The fact that you are still there in court and would still have to be there in court, that's what is it that you can, you offered some interpretation, but you might be saying, look, there's 95% that this hand belongs to this man. Is there a downside to the fact that you are there as an expert human witness, in that that the lawyers who perhaps aren't will be looking at the human and the fallible, and not just the human and fallible in the evidence, but the human and fallible in you or in the other witnesses, to sort of undermine the amazing data that the AI is presenting to them?
So our courtroom in the UK, our system is an adversarial system, which means that we have two perspectives. One side is evidencing what is their case and what they say will happen. And the other side just has to show with reasonable doubt that that's not possible. They don't have to prove innocence or guilt from the defense. So when you're in that gladiatorial system, then the real skill of the lawyer is in their communication and their ability to extract information from the expert and to be able to offer alternatives and opportunities. And as an expert witness, one side of the room, especially if your evidence is critical to that case, one side of that room will want to label you as the world's leading expert, and the other side will want to undermine you in some way to show that you're not somebody to be trusted. So I can't see the courtroom being prepared to lose the nuances of an adversarial system, because it is their way to test not only the research and the evidences in front of them, but also the understanding, the experience of the expert who's interpreting it.
I'd just like to add that this is open access, your research, isn't it? You're sharing it, you've not patented it, you're not making loads of money out of it. This is for police forces and the criminal justice system to
Yeah,
use.
I mean, our intention is that these algorithms that we produce can be given to any police force anywhere, and it means that the expertise that is held in my team can be used across the world and in a way that supports justice. And if you take what is called black box science into the courtroom and you counter evidence how you got to your result, and somebody else can come along and do the same thing, the court will not allow it in. So for this kind of AI evidence to go into the courtroom, it has to be open source, which takes away those issues of the fact that I am certainly never going to be a millionaire or a billionaire into the kind of research that I do. And that's not what justice should be about anyway.
Thank you. I think you'll all agree that's a really fascinating example of the use of AI. Can we go on to the area of friendship or relationships? I mean, Kathleen's raised this question in the chat box about the object-rich environment for Europeans. Fewer young people having intimate partnerships. What's the relationship between the development of AI and that? Kathleen, I'm sure you can answer your own question, but let's see what, Laura, do you have any thoughts on that, first of all?
You're a darling, thank you. You see, you don't need AI for you to get the message that I really wanted to say. So let's go friend, sexual relation, porn, mental health. If it's true, and I don't know if the data is still true, that 1 in 3 hits on the internet are for porn, what does this mean? And that is definitely AI. It's not shiny robots, but this is definitely a result of mass data. And I think it's extremely, I think it's extremely concerning. Any kind of handing over of the difficulties, the annoyances of human relationships, the grunginess, all that horrible stuff, as well as the delightful stuff, to an AI, I would say is very problematic.
Okay, so devil's advocate here. It's a very imperfect world. There are a lot of people who are using pornography with real life human victims. If you can have a AI replica of a person to interact with, to meet some of that heavily, in inverted commas, well, let's not even call it a need, that demand, is that a helpful thing? Laura wants to reply. I know Kathleen will want you to.
I do. So let's just say it's practice. Let's say I'm practicing either sexual acts or relationship acts, not that you can necessarily separate the two, and it is worrying if you might, then I think that is still wrong. Because one of the things about the dance of sexuality and sexual relations is that you get it wrong and that it's messy. And it's not only not going to help you practice for another human, it might be counterproductive because it depletes your capacity to get it wrong.
Let's go to Kathleen briefly now. Kathleen founded the campaign against the sex robots. Kathleen.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say about Sue's work, thank you so much for what you do and everything. It's obviously an issue, obviously child abuse online, and there are attempts, this issue has come up in regard to children. In fact, you won't believe it, but recently I was invited to review a paper that referred to paedophilic behavior as minor attracted persons, because there's a big culture to kind of rehabilitate paedophilia going on across Europe. So you'll probably, if you're not familiar with that term, you'll probably start to hear it in the next few years, unless people like me step in, and Sue and everybody else in this room, to stop that kind of language becoming normalized. But they would argue that the world is constructed, it's all about ontology again. So the world is constructed into a real world over here and a fictional world over there. And so over here is real things that go on, and over there is the fictional world. And what they argue is let the things go on in the fictional world. right? But that's not really how things are. What's the reason why there are child abuse representations in objects that we call dolls and robots is because there is child abuse against children. So people are not doing something new with the objects. Actually, they're only doing it because it exists in the world. Okay. And therefore, a lot of the focus can be around regulating the expressive forms of something, which is a step in the right direction, but more needs to be done at the political level to abolish the practices. And I'm proud to say I'm an abolitionist. I want to abolish the commercial sex trade, the prostitution trade. I think these are absolutely harmful for human beings. And there is an abolitionist community that are trying to work in these directions.
Thank you. Just a sort of additional point as well. If we're talking about companionship, be it sexual or platonic, with an AI assistant of any form, you've got to be asking who owns it, who's absorbing the data that you're providing. If it's your communication on a conversational level, you're perhaps willing to share certain things. If it's sexual behavior, you're sharing certain things. There's a lot of conversation lately about just simple apps that keep track of periods. Where's that data going? What is the personal details that you're providing over to corporations? And this goes as well. I've just given a paper on the metaverse, and this is a space that companies are directly moving into, where they want to absorb as much of your behavioral data as possible. So that's just another sort of slightly tangential point to the more ethical concerns that were raised.
Very quick point about this conversation with regard to sex robots. I've spoken to Kathleen about this before, and she and I are in lockstep about this. I think it demonstrates the weakness and inadequacy of utilitarianism. I think you can mount a utilitarian argument for sex robots if you're just doing a calculus in terms of pleasure and pain, but actually we don't operate like that. If you saw a close relative of yours watching virtual pornography, AI pornography, or buying a sex robot, say an underage looking sex robot for their own gratification, you would be horrified. The philosopher Mary Measley used to talk about the yuck factor, which used to surge up within us, inchoate and inexplicable and yet extremely powerful. When it comes to these things, I think we naturally fall back into being virtue ethicists, and we realize that pain and pleasure calculus, or the happiness and sadness calculus, really doesn't cut the mustard when it comes to evaluating what we want from human beings, and that the desire to want and to be good is deep and profound within us.
Well, let's move the calculus on to something a little bit more ambiguous, perhaps, which is companionship, machines as companions or carers. And I mean, even 5 years ago, you had I don't know how many thousand robots in Japan who are sort of doing supposedly caring tasks. I mean, 26% of Japanese nursing homes 5 years ago were using robots in some sort of caring role. So, I mean, what are the considerations there? Do you think? Laura, do you want to come in on this? And then
yes. So I think in a way it parallels what we were saying about forensics, or being able to have AI accompany humans. And there are great situations where an AI dressed up as a robot can be involved in the process of, and I wouldn't use the word caring because they're not caring. They are functioning alongside a human, or sometimes instead of a human, in a role that we would call caring if a human did it. And I think that there are instances that is absolutely appropriate. And of course, Japan is not just because it's technologically advanced, but also because they have a real problem with the disproportion of older people and younger people not to be able to look after them because of the way their population works. So there are places for it, and certainly in the world of dementia, as long as you have human supervision and intervention.
Mark Vernon, if we're talking about you wrote a book on friendship, so on the different kinds that are available. Now we're saying, look, you can't really be friends with an AI machine, but what would be the sort of considerations, the philosophical considerations that you would bring to determining how near to a friend AI might be, and also that difference, that tension between the perfect and the good enough in terms of having some of our human needs for companionship and friendship met?
Well, one of the thoughts that came to my mind was that this discussion is actually very ancient. Who you can be friends with was something that Plato and Aristotle tussled about. And then strangely enough, it became really important in early Christianity, because there was a huge debate about whether you could love the sacrament, say, and what the role of symbols and icons, of course, were, which people wanted to treat, not just in reverent ways, but in ways that seemed akin to animate, people as well in their lives. And broadly, I think what was concluded was that when objects or things are in kind of a dance with either humans or God, then the friendship can be sort of regarded as valid and true, because the symbol, if you like, is leading to friendship, love with reality. And so this was the way that it was kind of talked about, and became very important in theurgic practices, sacraments, and so on. But the point was, I suppose, that the friendship or the love with an object is in the service of life itself. So as long as you have a vision of life, then you're doing okay. And I think that the worry now would be that with the kind of, the numinous effect of AI and technology and black box computers and so on in our lives, which can feel almost like a sort of divine presence, but of course it's not. And so the worry is that we lose and get dragged down, if you like, rather than lifted up through our love of objects.
I don't know if you want to come in here, Scott Midson from the University of Manchester is on the call.
My interest in this is that I've recently done a project on, well, I'm still working on love and robots and different types of love. And similar to what was just said, it's the different ways of thinking about love that aren't necessarily solely human-centered. So I have a background in theology, and we can think about love in ways that involves kind of divine sort of ideas or non-humans in various kind of ways that we might conceive of it. And actually, robots and machines mythologically and also as objects have a deep history in those kind of relational narratives, not as things that care for us or things that we love in a reciprocal way, but actually as things that might mediate a different type of love. In theological traditions, the notion of agape is quite significant for that. So we have these mediational, devotional devices. And I think there's something in that. So I think it was Laura who said earlier on about objects and robots not caring themselves, but used in caring ways. And I think when we think about use value of objects, we need to not think about them. I said it in the chat. We need to not think about that techno rhetoric of this is going to fix a problem. I don't like the language of robots are just tools, because the just or the tools, we have certain assumptions about that. I think there's the aesthetic of robots that's clearly more than just a kind of a hammer or a wrench or something. So there's that kind of side to it. But I think we can think about what those kind of use values of these things are, and also the ways that they might actually complicate our relationships, and that's okay as well. We don't have to see these technologies as a fix in any way, shape or form. And in the relational setting, that's kind of part and parcel of what it is to be in relationships and relationalities.
Andrew Brown, you wanted to come in. I'm looking back up in the chat now. But I will just let you bring in the point that you wanted to move us on to.
Well, this is a bit where the AIs are being used for clearly malicious purposes. Someone trained GPT-3, which is the up to the minute text generation thing, and really quite spooky, on the outpourings of one of the nastiest bulletin boards on the internet, 4chan's poll channel. And then having fed all this hate speech, racism, etc. into it, then it then generates from these prompts perfectly plausible continuations, which this person then fed back into the channel from which they'd come. And so on one day, I think, quarter of all the sort of hate speech coming out on this channel was generated by an AI whose code, and Beth can put me right here if I misunderstood it, is still publicly accessible. So you can basically download your own bigotry factory powered by a cutting edge AI. Well, this just came out this morning, but as an example of the, do we want AI to put bigots out of work?
Beth, you've said it's not spooky, it's just a correlation machine. Can you explain that? I don't understand.
No offense to Andrew, but that is our tendency to reify and even deify AI, to see the outputs of just simple correlations between X and Y to give an output as somehow mysterious. We saw this with AlphaGo when it played a move and everyone started calling it a divine move as per the tradition of the game Go, as though this was some sort of like transcendental spiritual moment. And this is some of my research has specifically looked at how we see the non-transparency and the obtuseness of AI and fit into that space some of our godlike language and our metaphors. It's our instinctive response and our intuitive response to see things in this way, but really what it's doing is very simple. It just seems magical because we don't understand it, and we have to avoid that kind of magical thinking if we want to be realistic about the impact it's going to have.
But surely the problem here is that the readers, as it were, of this stuff don't know it's an AI. They think they're getting the same reinforcement as they would be getting from a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the social impact, but that's not what GPT-3 is doing. That's the application of GPT-3 to a specific space for that purpose. So we have to be clear, it's the human implementation of the app. The app itself is, it's complicated in technological terms, but it's only really doing correlation. It's not doing inspiration and creativity.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I wonder if we should just sort of move on to some general thoughts about, how far we take AI, what we ban, and maybe in a more positive light, what might it mean for us to pursue the good life in an age of artificial intelligence? That's 3 big questions. Who would like to take them?
We don't know. Whenever any new technology comes in, it always takes quite a long time for us to figure out how to use it positively. An awful lot of technologies are invented during wartime. And then, so you get a really nasty technology that actually advances very quickly because of war, and then you turn it into something useful. And I think my best analogy would be the development of the motor car, and very early motor cars killed an awful lot of people. We killed about 10 times as many on the roads in the 1930s as we do now, and we have 20 times as many vehicles. So it took a while to figure out you had to have driving tests. You had to have pedestrian crossings. You had to have a social etiquette of how to drive. And I think that we're in those early stages with AI of just developing the social etiquettes and the legislation. And I don't think you can hurry this. I think it's just going to be a learning process that we just have to have constant vigilance, nudging, pushing. Sometimes laws work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you're better off doing things by social agreement. Sometimes you will do the wrong thing. And I just think we have to accept that and welcome that slowly, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, we use this wonderful new technology to create better lives for us.
I found you're quite positive. You're quite positive in your book about this as well. I mean, I suppose the difference between now and the 1930s is the level of globalization, corporate interests and so on, the growth in the number of billionaires and all the rest of it, which might just mean that we can't quite trust ourselves to get it right.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling about that is that actually in the 1930s, the business lobby, particularly in America, was very pro-German, I don't think that we should regard business as bad, or indeed billionaires as bad. I think there are other reasons for why we're having these huge increases in wealth inequality, and I'm probably as troubled by that as everybody else. But I think that, I suppose my bottom line is that global living standards are improving because of technology. Here is a new technology that works in services, and therefore we can go on increasing global living standards. With the one proviso, we have to do that in a way that doesn't do any more damage, and hopefully does much less to the resources of the planet. And I think that these new technologies have come in the nick of time, in a way, to enable us to do this.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Beth to respond, and then do please put up your hands, and I will go to people who haven't yet spoken. So I'll go to Beth, and then please put your hands up.
Yeah, just on Hamish's points there, these technologies are arriving just in the nick of time. They don't come without a cost, obviously. But we've got to factor in the environmental cost of these solutions. I have a friend who told me recently he was at a conference and raised this as an issue and got whispered vehemently at, saying, well, you can't criticize AI because it's going to fix climate change. So, well, it's contributing. It's one of amongst many things that are contributing. It's all part of the same cycle. So I think that's something to be aware of. I'm also very hesitant of any kind of accelerationist model that doesn't realize we have limits on our resources, that speculates widely on distance traveling into the universe as a solution to the fact that we will ultimately run out of resources here. We've got to be concerned with where we are at the moment. And actually, I'm going to bring up very quickly my favorite William Gibson quote, who said the future's already here, it's just unequally distributed. And to say that we are seeing benefits from these technologies, we've got to really unpack who that we is, because they are not distributed equally. And there are people who are suffering specifically because of the materials required for artificial intelligence. So just to be the naysayer for a moment.
A couple of points worth making. The data are very clear, and Hannah mentioned this earlier on, that younger people are more open to these technologies than older people. And also, I think Hannah might briefly mention, if not I will, that people who have a higher level of education, higher terminal level of education, are also more open. And that's a very clear signal, sociologically speaking. Younger people and elites are more positive about this, means we're going to see a lot more of it. And I think the real danger here is that we're not great at having sort of collective conversations about common goods, because a lot of our language of our moral deliberation here is in terms of rights, and in terms of the market, and in terms of desires. And if that's the only kind of moral equipment we have to have these conversations, it's going to happen to us before we've really evaluated whether it's a good. Because frankly, there will be lots of people who do want sex robots, and who am I to get in the way of banning? Who am I to suggest banning them? There will be people who want their granny to have an AI friend, and frankly, who am I to say that they can't? And if that's the only equipment we have for the moral conversation, it's going to happen to us, and actually not by choice. It's going to happen to us because there are enormous commercial forces that want it to happen, before we've truly evaluated whether that will I'm using an old-fashioned word, improve levels of virtues, increase levels of virtue or collective responsibility in society.
Yeah, I mean, who are those conversation partners that you want to bring into the room?
This is inevitably a point in the conversation where you get really, really vague, and you just wave airily at civil society and faith groups and other things like that. I mean, that's basically what I'm going to do. I mean, in a sense, several people have remarked in these conversations we've had the last 3 weeks or so that, nobody thinks that AI really has a soul, and from the data, nobody really would prefer a surgeon to operate than a human being. But they're provocations, they're deliberate provocations to get people thinking about what would it be like if, and why not? Why would we draw the line, and how firmly would we draw it? And these are the conversations that do occur in civil society and Radio 4 and newspapers and comment pages, and that's where it's got to happen. I'm not saying those conversations don't happen, but I think they need to happen a lot more.
Thank you. Do put your hand up. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Sue Black, I don't know if you want to add anything to what you were telling us earlier, or if any thoughts have occurred to you during this conversation which you'd like to share.
Thank you, Rosie. It's very kind of you, and it's been really interesting to listen to all the different perspectives. And you know, as somebody who is not young, and somebody who is certainly not elite, I can understand what the attraction is. But part of me fears the loss of choice. So when you have a commercial drive and a really strong, almost irresistible commercial drive for something to happen, at what point as an individual do you lose that innate sense of choice? My example for that is, if tomorrow all of the mobile phone providers in the world said the only way you're going to be able to access your phone is to use a fingerprint, I will never give anybody any of my biometrics. My choice is to keep my biometrics to myself. Once I give them away, I can never bring them back. And so do I lose the choice if a commercial drive on AI works against what I think is a human right to make that decision of, I want to live my life, I'd love to have a phone, but I'm not prepared to pay the price to give it over. And I watch my younger daughters, who have no trouble at all putting their fingerprints on things and their iris scans on it and everything else. And it just worries the living daylights out of me in a world where, when we give over at times what are these inherent markers of who we are, what that does to our identity.
Right, okay, thank you very much. We've got time for one last comment. If someone's put their hand up. That's Mike Hill. We've not heard from you yet, Mike.
I'm from High Wycombe. I'm a retired Methodist minister and a scientist. But it seems to me that we've only just begun on this AI thing. 10 years ago, I don't think anybody knew that phrase at all. We are at the very, very beginnings, and it will develop and increase in ways that we cannot possibly even imagine at the moment. It will come, and it will come a little bit at a time, assisting human beings, and the assistant will get better and better and will do more and more useful things, and frankly sometimes the assistant will take over from the master, and the master won't be very pleased with it, especially if the assistant is getting better at it than the master was, and we're reluctant to allow that. But as I see it, this artificial intelligence is something which will catch up and overtake humanity, and for all that we want to say, well, we are the special ones. I think it will overtake us.
Harris Bohr, you had your hand up.
One observation that Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, made was that we're stuck between desire and boredom. We kind of fluctuate between these two extremes. And it strikes me that what we really want is a world where we have this sweet spot and we retain that sweet spot. We don't want all our desires to be fulfilled. We want imperfection. We want to have something to complain about. And we don't want to be bored. And I think AI has the dangers of basically taking us to one of these extremes. And I think we want to try and keep that balance.
Thank you. Now we're going to have to end there. I'm going to leave the chat box open just for a few minutes if people are just wanting to exchange contacts and bits of news or views on it. But I'd just like to thank you all. Thank you to Theos for setting the agenda for the last 3 weeks. And to all of you who've helped me between Zooms with my planning for these sessions, and to all of you who've joined us, those who've contributed, those who have been with us. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed these sessions. So I'm going to say goodbye now. I'm going to plan myself something nice for Tuesday afternoon so that I don't get lonely. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.